Today on the Crit House, we welcome renowned UK-based portrait photographer Harry Borden. His work has appeared in The New Yorker, Vogue, and Time magazines, and he has twice won World Press Photo Awards. In 2005, Harry had a solo exhibition at London's National Portrait Gallery, which now holds over 100 of his prints. An honorary fellow of the Royal Photographic Society, he has published several acclaimed books, including Survivor, a portrait of the survivors of the Holocaust, Single Dad, and On Divorce. Join us as Harry shares his myFIVE images that have shaped his vision as a photographer. Those images from Richard Avedon, Irving Penn, Martin Parr, Larry Sultan, and Diane Arbus. So Harry Borden, welcome to the Crit House. It's nice to have you on the program. We normally, we being me, tend to be so American in our focus that it's nice to have somebody from across the pond. And so welcome to the program. Welcome to the Crit House.
I should probably point out that my father was American, and I was born in New York.
Well, that makes you acceptable then. That's why you're here. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, in fact I won 2 World Press Photo Awards, and in the book you have to sort of say your nationality, and in the first one I sort of paid respect to my kind of heritage by sort of mentioning the fact that I was born in the States and I've got an American passport.
Well, so, welcome back to your country.
Yeah, my dad, who's probably a huge influence on me, and actually, in the choices that I made, his voice was probably there. Particularly, I think in the case of one of them, he would always point out that actually he was an American, but he liked the idea of he was a first generation immigrant, and America was the dream, and so he was very, very patriotic and proud of the country.
There are many that way.
Yeah.
Hey, Harry, why don't you do me a favor? Introduce yourself to this audience. Who are you as a photographer? What have you done? And so we know a little bit about you, and we'll show some of your images as well.
Okay, I'm a photographer. I'm based in the UK. I've worked editorially probably, or actually all of my kind of career, and I've worked for every major. I've been commissioned by the New Yorker, Vogue, Time, shot covers of Time magazine. Latterly, in the last 15 years, in parallel with my editorial commissions, I've also derived a great deal of satisfaction from doing personal projects. I think when you get to middle age, you start to sort of question your choices, and I felt it was incumbent upon me to use the skills that I'd garnered from being an editorial photographer to do projects that I felt invested in. So my first project, as I said, was probably a bit to impress my dad, and it was portraits of Holocaust survivors, which resulted in Survivor, a portrait of the survivors of the Holocaust, which came out in 2017. And then following that, I was unfortunate enough to get divorced, and for me, in that kind of catastrophic event, the thing that kind of really came to the fore was that it could impact on my children. And so my second book was called Single Dad, and it was portraits of single parent fathers. And then that Alain de Botton, who runs the School of Life, which is a huge platform for mental health and so on, and publishes books, he liked that book, and he got me to do another book called On Divorce. So I do projects that kind of enrich my life, that I derive intrinsic pleasure from the process of making, and I'm lucky enough that I still get commissions on a sort of daily basis. I try and do things because of as I say, the intrinsic pleasure. So if I enjoy taking pictures, and I enjoy the process of meeting people and recording that relationship, and that's probably reflected in the pictures that I've chosen, because I've just realized they're mostly portraits.
You also have a rather popular and entertaining YouTube channel with your son.
Well, it's funny because I have my children are really involved in all my projects. So my eldest daughter, she actually works for Meta. She's a researcher, but she's actually probably the most kind of naturally creative of my 4 children. And she finds it very calming and therapeutic to draw, just to draw it, to be at the moment and to draw pictures. And I sort of took this and realized in 2019 we had the potential for an interesting project. So since then, whenever we're together, she draws me and I do a portrait of her.
Oh,
And then my son Fred, with whom I have the YouTube channel, he was a software engineer, sort of back end developer, and he's also a very creative, talented person. And he's been bugging me, or he suggested the idea of doing this YouTube channel, which consists of me pontificating about the Spice Girls or Baroness Thatcher or Ewan McGregor or whoever it happens to be, famous, Charlton Heston or whoever it is. Over the course of 35 years, I've photographed everybody.
hey, tell us about the five images you chose. So,
Yeah, I mean, you sent me the email and I did it very, very quickly. The first person that always comes into my head is Diane Arbus, who is a huge influence on me. And I go back to the monograph book that she did repeatedly, and it always looks fresh. I mean, for me, the barometer of whether you're a good photographer or not is if you succeed in taking pictures that no one can forget, that stay with you, that are etched into your memory. Another element to making a great photograph is actually introducing an element of ambiguity and asking questions and sort of not telling the viewer what to think. Not a picture that's a one note that you could sit with and you could look at it every day and it would reveal something of itself. Then the others were kind of more, I mean, obviously, Irving, Penn, Richard Avedon, they're the best, alongside Arbus for me. So I had to, they really picked themselves. And then over other things that also were under consideration was Harry Callahan's pictures of his wife Eleanor, which
Eleanor.
I find incredibly moving.
Yes.
And maybe I was thinking about it, I should have included one of his pictures because they're more like they're more environmental portraits, almost landscapes.
Yeah.
Because my selection is quite portrait heavy.
Well, I'm glad you referenced him. Harry Callahan is special to me. Let's take a look at your five images. You referenced Richard Avedon, and we start with this fantastic image from him.
Well, I think it's worth mentioning my dad because although my dad wasn't very encouraging and after reams of sort of therapy, well, a little bit of psychotherapy, my psychologist and I came to the conclusion that he was somewhat of a narcissist. But he did do one thing, and that was broaden my horizons. He'd worked as an art director in advertising. He joined the American Marines to fight Hitler, and then he went into advertising. And he was one of those guys. He was Don Draper. He was a madman. He worked at Young and Rubicam, and he was a very successful art director. So he worked with Avedon and Penn. He even commissioned Andy Warhol to do illustration before Andy Warhol was a conceptual artist.
Wow.
When Avedon brought out the series that he made, of which this picture is part,
The American West.
yeah, he drew my attention to it, and it just blew me away. And it would have been obvious to include the picture with the bees. I mean, as I said with the Diane Arbus picture, all of these pictures are etched into my memory.
Yeah.
But I think this picture that was used on the cover is more subtle and it kind of reveals something. I think I'd rather have this on the wall because I think it's less showy and it's intriguing. I think really it represents a body of work which is a masterpiece. And Richard Avedon is a genius of photography, and anyone wanting to learn about photography, he really still hasn't been bettered in terms of portraiture and his mastery of the medium. And these pictures are they're just incredible. But his whole body of work is incredible. But I think these are kind of a really important legacy, and they say something profound about America.
And then another great, Irving Penn.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say Penn is probably on his own in terms of the sheer kind of brilliance, and the composition is just masterly, complete control. And I picked this picture because you probably have the greatest artist that's ever lived, which is pretty. It's pretty. I mean, he probably was pretty great when this picture was taken, but it's probably the best headshot you could possibly take. It's deceptively simple, and yet there's a lightness of touch as well. There's a sort of humanity and a kind of dignity to the picture and a vulnerability, which is typical of Penn. And I have photographed people who've been photographed by Penn, and I'm always asking them questions about his modus operandi,
Mm.
and it was always about, like Diane Arbus, a record of the relationship the person had, the photographer had with the person on the day. And quite often they say that he would just talk to the person for, half an hour, and then the shoot would actually be very, very, very quick because, again, he had complete control over the medium. It doesn't really get any better, and it's a great place to start. If you look at these pictures and notice where the light's coming from, they're not kind of complicated. They're not exercises in the photographer showing off.
Yeah.
They're a master, someone who's mastered the medium and has done just enough to kind of create a genuine moment that is married to a complete control of photography.
Martin Parr.
Yeah, it's interesting to see that photograph that you've put on, because I've got this print. I actually bought a print off Martin, and it's actually cropped in slightly. But for me, the personal introduction to Martin Parr happened in 1987 when I was at college, and I went to see a body of work at the Plymouth Arts Centre, of which this picture is part of. Called The Last Resort, and
Hmm.
the pictures were taken on medium format and they were taken in color, which was very, very different approach back then for a documentary series. And they just blew me away. I just thought they were extraordinary. I picked this picture out because I just thought it was funny and kind of powerful. And what happened was I was commissioned to photograph Martin for a magazine, not a photography magazine. I mean, he's in the UK. I mean, he's probably the most successful UK photographer easily, and really genuinely globally renowned. I was commissioned to go to his house, and I thought we were getting on quite well. His wife made us a cup of tea and some cake and so on, and we were promised an hour. And I thought, well, I'm going to get more than an hour because we're friends. On an hour, it was like, okay, you need to get out of here. We've done it. But I like the pictures I took, and I told him about Plymouth College of Art and Design where I'd studied, and I told him about this kind of road to Damascus moment when I walked into that art center and I saw his exhibition, and I just was very blunt. I decided to be blunt with him, and I just said, how much will you sell me a print from The Last Resort for cash? I won't tell you how much I paid, but it'll probably, I think it'll end up being a good investment.
Right.
And I have it above my piano, and when I'm playing the piano, I sometimes look at it, and it conforms to what I was talking about before. You can look at it and notice things different on every day. It's sort of
Yeah.
it's not one note. It's quite explosive and confrontational. There's a subtlety to it as well. There's a lot going on. I think for me, it's kind of the embodiment of what it's like to be an awkward adolescent. The boy holding the ice cream is sort of like probably brazenly making her feel quite uncomfortable, and she just looks like she's at the end of her tether. But
Yeah, she's
compositionally, the color palette, it was like one of those wonderful moments where it's a genuine moment, but then aesthetically everything's coming together as well.
yeah, love it so much. And now Larry Sultan, and I'm gonna take a flying leap and guess that this is because of his relationship with his family.
This actually did remind me of my dad, because towards the end of his life, another thing I did as a dutiful son was to buy him a set of golf clubs, because he would always talk about the fact that he used to be a caddy at a golf club in Westchester County, and he'd make a few quid, and he always made out that he was a good golfer. So and I play golf, so I thought, well, we'll put this to the test. And he wasn't as good as he said he'd been, but then by then he was in his 70s, and this picture reminds me of my dad. But it's also brilliant. I love the sort of shape and the form, and I love the conceit of going back, staying with your parents, and sort of coldly, in a cerebral way, kind of documenting them in a very kind of revelatory way, in a visual way. Pictures like this can be very sentimental, but it's also kind of intriguing as well because the carpet is a wonderful shade of green that could be grass, and normally you wouldn't swing a driver in a house, but it's one of those, probably in Florida or somewhere like that, where the houses are quite oversized. But it's just always been a memorable picture for me. I mean, I really like Larry Sultan's work. It's just typical. It's, again, I think it's probably on medium format, so there's that extra bit of quality,
Yep.
but it's a genuine moment. That those two things coming together. If you can kind of marry great photographic technique and also allowing it to just be about silhouette. It's not a portrait. There isn't a highlight in the eye. It's about shape and form, and just that exposing for the light coming through, effectively underexposing. But it's all the better for it. It's a wonderful sort of environmental portrait.
And just the incongruity of the television and the
Yeah.
announcer. It's just it wouldn't be the same picture without just that little
Oh,
element over the
100%.
side. Yeah,
Yeah.
beautiful. You mentioned Diane Arbus before, and here we
Yeah.
are.
I mean, Diane Arbus, I just go back to her all the time. I'm obsessed with her. I've got lots of other books and biographies, and I was sort of incensed when Nicole Kidman played her in the film with Robert Downey Jr. because that wasn't what I kind of thought. I mean, it should have been played by Samantha Morton, actually, who I photographed, and I remember her telling me that she would have liked to have played Diane Arbus. And I'm just so astonished at the huge number of absolute humdinger pictures that she managed to create in the short time that she was working as a photographer. I mean, she used the term freaks. And I mean, there were people on the margins, sort of minorities, people that were kind of part of the scene that she was in New York, that she sort of, as she kind of inhabited. And she obviously had such a good rapport with people because I think she probably identified with their pain. And I think all the pictures sort of embody this idea that she's not a tourist. I mean, she's kind of enthralled to the way they look. She makes them kind of interesting and heroic, but at the same time there is compassion there, because I think that has the same sort of issues. I mean, this picture is just one of the earliest pictures that I noticed, that I sort of subconsciously find myself trying to subconsciously being aware of. I like the softness of the light. When you start as a photographer, your first instinct is to have the sun behind you and sort of realize, you start to notice where the light's coming from, and you want your subject to be really well lit. This was sort of instrumental, I think, in me kind of realizing that the most interesting pictures, the pictures that have a strange atmosphere, that are kind of profound and disturbing, and compelling, quite often they're just available light, really weird available light, that the light of which is coming through your window onto your face and sort of blinding you and so on. You know, that's what I look for in my portraits, is sort of those things that you couldn't anticipate, that serendipitous light that just sort of comes out of nowhere, and sort of suddenly there's a strange atmosphere. And this has got this in spades. I mean, it must have been, it's almost underexposed. There's no highlight in her eyes. She's sort of strange and vulnerable and ghost-like, and I just find it unforgettable and incredibly intriguing.
Yeah, so much of her work is that way. You're
Yeah,
absolutely right. So,
yeah.
well, sir, Harry Borden, what a pleasure to talk to you. I do want to say to the audience, since you referenced the light, I kept the light and didn't cover it up because of you. So I'm taking a lighting lesson from you during this
Yeah,
discussion.
he wanted to change it, and I said, no, don't change it. It's sort of quite interesting. It wasn't quite as hard. And then as we were talking, I was thinking, you shouldn't
It's
have listened to me. What do I know?
well, light does change. Do you have any last thoughts about things about your images that you did not mention? Any just final pieces?
Yeah, I mean, I do. I would like to. I do like Harry Callahan. I find myself, my mind drifting back to that, and then there are lots of pictures that along the way. There's a picture that Willie Ronis did. I mean, I don't know if it was a girlfriend or his wife, of a woman from behind a basin in Paris. It's wonderfully romantic. It's definitely the male gaze. I don't know if that's a problem. There are all these pictures. There's a wonderful picture. I think it's might be Martine Frank, of a boy on a hammock by a swimming pool, and it's sort of a wonderful exercise in light and shade. I could have picked that one. That's the wonderful thing. All these pictures sort of end up informing your practice, and they end up kind of becoming an integral part of how you evolve as a photographer.
Well, I hope you found it to be an interesting process to choose those images and sort of look back on yourself. But because I find it fascinating to hear. I feel like it's a little bit like going back into a photographer's DNA, right? To find out where they came from and why they are who they are by discussing the images that had some influence on them.
Yeah,
So Harry Borden, thank you so much for joining us on the Crit House. It's been a great conversation.
I've really enjoyed it.
All right, and thank you all for watching the Crit House.